Cryo Ranger is terrible. In my opinion, probably the worst tower in the game. The concept of freezing enemies while also dealing damage seems great, and has been done many times before with success. So what makes Cryo so bad? First, so you understand what went wrong, let me tell you how two towers succeeded and where this one failed. Cowboy from TDS and the John Tower in TDX. The Cowboy was a compression of a DPS tower and an economy tower. So Cowboy is worse at being both to balance out. In early game, you can either choose to farm or to defend. It's hard to do both, so you have Cowboy to make money while you defend, to afford farms while also having a decent defense. No other tower could do this, but TDS bouncing is terrible in game modes and towers, so people use Cowboys for other things also. The John Tower in TDX is another role compression tower, but it is fundamentally different from the Cowboy. The John Tower is both a DPS tower and a support tower. The John Tower, since being both, is now a worse support tower and DPS tower. The support tower part didn't get nerfed as heavily, probably only getting a slight support nerf and a cost increase. This tower is now a support tower with the added bonus of dealing damage. Yes, there is a bottom path which doesn't buff anything, but no one actually uses it. This tower is very useful because not only are there no other towers that can support other towers while dealing damage to enemies, but also no other support towers which can boost damage. These two towers were very useful and a good example of role compression. There are, of course, many ways role compression is used for. One being two roles combined so they can do two things so that you can bring an extra tower. But I only went in depth about Cowboy and John because they did right what Cryo Ranger did wrong. So why is Cryo Ranger so bad? Before I continue this section, I just want to say I will make Cryo Ranger sound like a really bad tower, but these reasons are not the reasons I think Cryo Ranger is the worst tower in the game. I will state those reasons in the next section, but the reasons in this section will help you to understand the next section. Cryo Ranger is a role compression with a DPS tower and a freezing tower. Both properties get nerfed equally, so it is now a worse DPS tower and a worse freezing tower. This tower cannot be substitute for both a DPS tower and a freezing tower, because not only can it not deal damage, nor freeze multipliers, meaning it won't attack other enemies because it's too focused on trying to kill the multipliers, but also doesn't deal enough damage to the enemies, and the freeze doesn't slow them down enough to make them attack for long enough. The freeze only freezes the front enemies, and you need a lot of Cryo Rangers to even get some frozen. And by the time they're frozen or even slowed down, more will come from behind, making them previously frozen ones unfrozen, and over until there's so many that you can't even slow any, and they get passed into the base, and you lose. Good thing to have a cryo grenade to deal splash freeze. And while yes, that does work, it costs more than the top path and deals much less damage than the top path. Okay, so it's not meant to be in the place of a DPS and freeze tower. How about just a DPS tower? Again, no. It deals such a low amount of damage, it's just not even worth using it for that. Okay, so how about as a support / freeze tower, with the added benefit of dealing damage? Again, no. You need to spam these towers to even deal freezing to make it worthwhile. If a fast, high freeze tolerance guy comes along, it ruins everything. I do have to say bottom path is alright because of the splash from the grenade, but it's still not enough. There is one good thing about Cryo Ranger, which I will say closer to the end of the video, and why that fact doesn't even matter. Cryo Ranger isn't terrible at all these things, but I'll state why I think this tower is so bad. It's because other towers do this tower's job better. The two main towers that do this tower's job better are Ranger, or practically any DPS tower, which is basically any tower in the game, and Cryo Blaster. I'll talk about why these are better in a minute, but I first want to clear this up. We already established that Cryo Ranger is not meant to be a replacement for two towers to save an extra slot. Either way, if you are at a point in the game where you would use it, you probably wouldn't have 6 towers anyway. Also, you can't argue that you may not have Ranger and Cryo Blaster when you get Cryo Ranger, because first of all, you get one at the start of the game, and the other you will 9 out of 10 times have Cryo Blaster when you beat the event. Sure, the event is easy, but people who say that probably don't just have Ranger, Operator, and Shotgunner in their inventory. If you need to freeze enemies, you aren't going to bring Cryo Ranger. You will bring Cryo Blaster along with DPS. If you need DPS, you are going to bring Ranger or almost any other tower in the game. Even the cost is worse. While the cost is somewhat better when being compared to Ranger, but not good at all when being compared to Cryo Blaster. When compared to Ranger, cross path, top path, getting one max cross top path, Cryo Ranger would cost 17,450. It would deal 86.7 DPS, have a 13.5 freeze rate, and 20 range. Getting one maxed out cross top path Ranger would cost 16,680, and it would have 83.3 DPS and 20 range. So if you say that 13.5 freeze rate and an extra 3 DPS is worth 8,000 or 800, then Cryo Ranger would be better in this case. Bottom path, these two towers both get grenades and both have the same range. Bottom Cryo Ranger costs 24,850, has 24.5 freeze rate and deals 63.2 DPS. Ranger costs 16,955 and deals 61.3 DPS. Cryo Ranger's grenade costs about 5,000 more than regular Ranger's ability, so again, very similar, but while Cryo Ranger is more expensive, I would say for cost purposes, it is better because of the grenade and passive ability and freeze. Okay, now comparing to Cryo Blaster. Here you will start to see some flaws in Cryo Ranger. For top path, we already know the stats for Cryo Ranger, but for Cryo Blaster, we need to find out. Also, yes, Cryo Blaster can deal damage if you didn't know. Cryo Blaster cross top path costs 13,375, has 10.5 range, 16.5 freeze amount, 3 splash radius, which is very good, and up to 20 DPS. Cryo Ranger has 67 more DPS, 3 less freeze rate, and 10 more range for 5,000 more. Cryo Ranger has a splash range of 3, meaning he can hit a lot of enemies, dealing more damage and using freeze rate a lot more. Because of this, I would say Cryo Blaster is a lot better. For cross bottom path, Cryo Blaster costs 23,700 and has no splash, but has 425 freeze rate, 18 range, and 66.7 DPS. Cross bottom path Cryo Ranger costs 6,000 less, has 2 more range and 20 more DPS, but has practically no freeze rate compared to Cryo Blaster. The answer is clear. Cryo Blaster is much better if you are going for freeze. Ranger versus Cryo Ranger is close, but I would have to say Cryo Ranger is better stats wise. But I do think Ranger is better than Cryo Ranger if your teammate has Cryo Blaster, but it was close. Now a few more points before I start to wrap up. This is something good about Cryo Ranger. I mentioned earlier, when paired with a splash tower, Cryo Ranger slows the front of the horde, so they all bunch up, which then if you use a splash tower like Grenadier or Missile Trooper, it can deal a lot of damage. While Cryo Blaster can also do this, I feel Cryo Ranger does this a bit better. Also, Cryo Ranger is seen as a tower which freezes and deals damage, but it is worse at both. Cryo Blaster freezes and deals damage, though albeit not as much, but at least the freeze rate doesn't suffer because of it. Okay, in conclusion, Cryo Ranger can be good if the only tower you have is Ranger and Shotgunner, but if you have anything better, Cryo Ranger will be thrown out before any other tower, because other towers just do its job better, even the starter tower, which is kind of sad. Which is why I believe this tower to be the worst in the game so far. There may be more added later which are worse, but who knows. Of course, I am not saying you're wrong for disagreeing. We all have opinions. This is just one of mine. But I always ask people, just take a second and consider it before immediately disagreeing with anything, with everything about it. I should have put this at the beginning, but whatever. Goodbye.